Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rejoining me on the podcast is my now good friend Elohim Monard. He didn't start as my friend. We reached out to each other on LinkedIn. He's been on the podcast a couple times. We've had a drink in person. Now I feel like he's a friend. So my friend Elohim came on the podcast. I obviously think every single podcast episode we do is great, but this one was particularly good because we went very in depth. We went in depth on a topic that I think is extremely important, and I learned a ton. And Elo has forgotten more about this subject than most people will ever learn. So I really encourage you to listen to the whole episode. You probably listened to the whole episode anyway, but just wanted to thank Elo for his insights and say how much I appreciated the conversation. Listeners, if you want to talk about anything you heard or anything else, you can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. Otherwise, take care of the people you love. Cheers, and see you out there. Yeah. Listeners who are not watching this on YouTube, which you can go watch this on YouTube if you want, Elo is wearing a Los Pollos Hermanos hat. And those of you who know what that means will know what that means. Elo, it's really good to see you and your hat.
Thank you. It's great to be here. As I was telling you in the very beginning, so I feel that I'm cheating with my ex right now because I'm now in the political communication world, but you are bringing me back to my previous world and knowledge and practice about crime prevention and crime issues.
Yes, so I'm happy to I'm happy to have you in it. I for a second thought that Giancarlo Esposito, who plays Gus Fring in Breaking Bad, was Bolivian, but he's not. He's actually Chilean. So I was going to make a segue to say we should just note that Bolivia had an attempted political coup here in the last 24 hours, 36 hours, and maybe we'll get into that in the context of.
I knew that was coming, so no worries. I'm ready.
Well, we should back into that because Bolivia probably is an interesting case study for violence in the region in general. But I have a couple of statistics to throw at you, and then honestly, I'm going to let you cook here because I know that this is your specialty.
That's why I have this cup.
Yeah. This is from the World Bank. So, quote, Latin America and the Caribbean is the most violent region of the world, and violence keeps rising. The number of homicides per person is 5 times higher than North America and 10 times higher than in Asia. The region has 9% of the global population and 33% of the world's deaths by homicide. Pretty bad. The World Bank, this is like they published this a year ago, but they're citing a report they did in 2012. I guess it's good to be the World Bank and nobody can do anything with you. Anyway, their 2012 report says that they did a study of 6 countries in the regions, and the estimated cost of violence was 8% of GDP. So for every 10% reduction in violence, they think that would lead to a 1 percentage point increase in annual economic growth in violent countries in the world. So those were a couple stats to sort of throw at you. We also, migration is also tied to this, and we could throw out a lot of different data about migration. But this was one that stuck out to me. In the first 9 months of 2023, almost 400,000 migrants passed through the Darien Gap. So that's the jungle that connects South America to North America. That's almost sort of 3 times what it was in the year before. So migration is increasing there. If you look at sort of land border encounters at the U.S.-Mexico border, they are up almost, triple sort of year on year. That's true of Mexico too. Annual Border Patrol migrant encounters by country up there as well. One of the interesting things has been sort of in the last couple of years, it's not Mexican migrants that are getting to the U.S. border. It is now, they are a significant share, but it's countries like Venezuela, like Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, where those numbers are going up considerably. In April 2024, actually, it was Venezuela had the number 1 position there as the number 1 source, which is something that maybe we'll get into as well. So, I could keep quoting stats all day. But where do you want to start, Elo? I know that we want to talk about political and social and economic impact, and we don't want to lose the thread there. But how do you want to lead into this?
So maybe one thing that for your audience is very relevant is the relationship of this problem that you clearly illustrated with the U.S. And there is a paradox there. because yes, crime is one of the most important problems in Latin America right now. And depending who you talk with, it could be the most important. Uh, but at the same time, you don't want that the relationship with the US would become only based on how to reduce crime.
Hmm.
That's a paradox because you need to address it. And we need the US to address it because, as you mentioned, and we can unpack this in a moment, because as you mentioned, migration is very related to this problem in many ways with many layers of complexity as a cause, as a consequence. Um, so the US could have a very important role here, also because of what has been called the war on drugs,
Hmm.
um, and other kind of support. But in parallel, the relationship with the US cannot be only reduced to drugs, crime, and migration. And that is a paradox because there you will hear from Latin America many people who will complain, hey, we are more than just crime, drugs, and migration. It's true. We are far more than that. But at the same time, they are at the core of our problems. So, how to manage that? It's a very big issue on international relations if you want to see it from that viewpoint.
Yeah. Um, I'm going to ask you an impossible question to answer, but I don't know what your answer is, so I want to ask it. Why is this such a big problem in Latin America and the Caribbean? What is special about it? Is it institutional? Is it something that's there in the geography of the place? Is it the inheritance of colonialism? I mean, it's probably all the above. But if you were to try and diagnose the problem, what is the problem?
I try to avoid the more determinist approaches. So if we go back to history and geography, we could become very determinist. So I try to avoid that part of the discussion. So I go to more immediate issues that I know that come from years before, but we have to address still right now. So one, and that is something that I would like to discuss actually when we talk about Bukele maybe today, that we cannot avoid talking about Bukele, is rule of law. So I think that Latin America has been struggling historically with rule of law because of its history of dictatorship and because of how it has transited to democracy in very uncompleted ways in some countries. And that also comes with the relationship with the armed forces, particularly the police and the militaries in some moments. And you can see that this discussion is still coming on the table when we discuss how Ecuador is reacting, how Milei wants to react, how Bukele is doing this new wave of a hard hand, and so on. So one is rule of law. Another one is, I'm pretty sure it is inequalities. And when we study crime, it is very important to understand that one thing is poverty and another one is inequality. So poverty is a problem in itself, but what usually a study says and the statistics says that trigger crime is inequality. And if you want to go even beyond, we can say that there is a trend that explains that hyper urbanization with conditions of weak institutions, we were discussing rule of law, inequalities and grievances would immediately trigger crime. And when I say hyperurbanization, it comes also with the discussion on economic growth. So in Latin America, we have had this peak of economic growth during the 2000s because of the rise of mineral prices mainly, and at the same time we had hyper urbanizations. We have people moving into the cities, and at the same time we had a lot of infrastructure built in the cities. So that was happening, but with, on a ground of weak institutions, inequality, and grievances that were not solved. And that is like, for those who study crime, could be A plus B equals C. Okay, and maybe one more thing to add uh, to this recipe is migration, which actually is another way of urbanization. So you have this disorganized urbanization. So you have that suddenly some cities in Peru, in Ecuador, in Colombia, because of Venezuela, in Brazil, because of Venezuelan migration, suddenly exploded of people. And they don't have public services enough to respond to that. So as you can see, I am approaching migration not as a way of, hey, they are bringing criminals to these countries, which I don't think it is the way to approach it, at least initially. We can discuss migration of criminals as a different problem. But the first issue is that you have many people moving around to cities without the provision to public services for them. So that is a kind of answer. I can add one more layer to corruption, and it comes with the relationship with the political bodies and crime, and that would like shape the this complexity of causes in Latin America. I would not say geography, and I would not say history from
Yeah.
200 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, you danced on a political red line is not the right word, but sort of a really contentious political issue in the United States, which is, are with migration, are they bringing in the criminals to the United States and things like that, which is something that Trump said on the campaign trail first in 2016. And it's not something I want to go too far down the rabbit hole with. I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that that's generally not the case, that people who immigrate to the United States, especially illegally, actually statistically commit fewer crimes, in part because if they commit a crime, they're going to be deported. So they're actually usually on better behavior than most are. If you are really concerned about that issue, you should be concerned about, to your point, money and corruption and money laundering and how sort of corrupt cartel leaders or major figures are washing their money through the United States or these other systems rather than worried about bodies at the border. Um, but I
I know
think you
that
also,
you don't want to go deeper on that, but I
oh,
think it's,
we can. Let's do it.
I want to be clear for your audience. So the amount of criminals that move from one country to the other as part of this wave of migration is minimal. Okay, it's minimal. It's a very, very low percentage. So most people move because they are looking for opportunities, and many people in countries like Venezuela, Guatemala, Honduras, even Mexico, they are fleeing from crime and violence. Actually, they are fleeing from extortion. They are fleeing because one of their nieces was part of this mess, so they could be hit as part of the spiral. So, in addition to that, migrants are victims of crime because when they are moving across the territory, they have to pay taxes to criminal organizations. They have to pay the coyote. The coyote at the same time has to pay the cartel. So, and eventually, those who arrive to the countries, to their new countries, are people who just want to work, but they were absolutely uh, their lives were extracted from these, their souls literally sometimes are extracted from these cartels. Some of them, a few of them, especially young people, could become criminals on the way, especially young people who don't have opportunities. Okay. But still, you have the most people are not criminals. That being said, this is very tricky, and many people would not be, I would say, even brave enough to tell this. But those criminals, in a very, very small percentage that move from one country to the other, could be really, really, really the bloodiest that you can find. So what you are bringing to other place is not an amount of criminals, but sometimes ways of doing crime that was not witnessed before in terms of intensity. And that is why sometimes you feel that it's like the problem is larger.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Before we get into some of the meat of what we're going to talk about, though, you sort of raised the issue of measuring crime, and you could see this just in those World Bank figures that I threw at you. Latin America, as a region, 33% of homicides, but there are parts of Latin America and the Caribbean where, I mean, a country like Chile or a country, at least until now, like Argentina, like we're not
Chile is
talking about.
increasing drastically in the last 2 years, but I
Yes,
buy it.
yes, yeah. But like generally speaking, like Chile was a place where, yeah, like pretty good versus like Honduras or Guatemala, or even compare Panama and Costa Rica versus Honduras and versus Guatemala and El Salvador, Nicaragua. I mean, we're in completely different universes there. Um, so is this, I guess, are these local problems? Is it okay in Nicaragua and in El Salvador? We have major crime problems, but it's not a regional problem. It's a regional problem because migration becomes a regional problem, or is it sort of a transnational? Are we talking about its multiple hemispheres now? Like it involves a general trend towards violence in both North and South America, and just this is just where it's starting. Like, how do you think about where the epicenters of this is, or is the epicenter just something is wrong in the entire system, and the system is what's producing this?
Okay, this is tricky because it requires an explanation. So it is both. You have a transnational problem with local expressions. So first, we have to understand the dynamics of crime. Crime, by definition, concentrates in space and people. Okay, so you will have that a whole country is not equally dangerous, but it has some states or cities that are more dangerous than others. And within those cities, you will have streets, and within those streets, you will have blocks, and within blocks, you will have corners.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can imagine that. You are in New Orleans, you can see that. You are visualizing that. However, when you measure, you're measuring cities. So maybe you in New Orleans, you're in a haven, and nothing will happen there. But 3 blocks from there, there is a street, there is a block, there is a corner. Okay, that is one idea. So in each country, in each city, crime will concentrate. At the same time, you have an explosion of transnational crime. So transnational organizations. You have the Sinaloa cartel in the Andean region. You have the Comando Vermelho, I think it is in Brazil, going into the Amazon in Ecuador and Colombia and Peru. You have the Tren de Aragua going all across where you will find migrations from Venezuela to other places. So you have this transnational crime. However, we cannot imagine this right now as it was with Pablo Escobar or El Chapo time, which is everything another century and pre-pandemic, which is literally another era.
Mm-hmm.
So post-pandemic, what we see is that we have like these whole networks of organization that you can say to some extent they are very strong disorganized crime or organizations.
Mm.
Okay, so now because you will have local capacities and local relations. Tren de Aragua, for example, is a fantastic benchmark of outsourcing. What they are doing is they don't fight with local crime organizations. They provide services. You need killers? I have killers. You need to enforce taxes? I can enforce taxes. You need new audiences, I can reach out to them. So they are a perfect example of how they adapt. And with the vacuum of power that started when Venezuela realized that everybody was blaming the government, so you will have that like new leaders that are not essentially trained at agua, but uh, trained at agua born newborns. So everything to say that you have transnational crime, transnational networks all across the region, the Americas, that you are not witnessing in the U.S. in the same way that in Mexico or Brazil. It doesn't mean that it is not happening here. There is a fantastic journalist in Grillo, that I think it is his
Yep,
name, Ian
it is. Yeah.
Grillo,
Mhm.
who was documenting in the last weeks how this crime is happening in the U.S. Undercover or in different ways. So it is transnational, but and this is very important to understand. You have local control with different characteristics. So you have cities, or you have parts of cities, or you have towns that are sometimes completely managed by crime. In some places, specific within countries, not the whole country, but in some places within a country, you can have uh, localities that are absolutely controlled by crime organizations.
Well, let's take your home country of Peru then. Where are places where the government has no control?
The Amazon, if you go to Madre de Dios, which is right now Tambopata, which is one of the provinces within Madre de Dios, which is a region which is similar to a state in the US for those the audience. So Madre de Dios, which is in the southern part of the Amazon region in Peru, very close to Brazil and Bolivia, you see that that part is completely taken by illegal miners, completely taken by illegal miners, and police and even military cannot do anything right now there. And this comes with the linkages with politics. You will have a congressman from Madre de Dios, a representative of Madre de Dios, who was an illegal miner before, or at least an illegal miner defender. So they have political power at the same time, and it's controlled. So you will have a mayor, you will have a governor, but at least they have linkages, if not are part of the criminal organizations. And within this, only to finish the idea, within these provinces, you will have some specific places that actually you cannot enter, even if you are the government, without the permission of these people.
And what is I mean, I know we're speaking about the Peruvian context where I know you have personal experience, but so what does the government just accept that? Does it just write it off? Is it something that the policymakers in the government are thinking about and how to take it back? Is it more about, okay, give them that so it doesn't expand into other areas of our control because we want to contain the problem? How do you think governments like that, and we will get into Bukele and how those sorts of political leaderships are responding to this. But if you're a democratically elected government and most of your country is okay, but you've got these spots, like how are you dealing with that?
Okay, there are different answers for that. One brings us back to the discussion of rule of law. Do we have the capacity to enforce really law on those places? Do we have our police is prepared for that? So I think that in most countries in Latin America, our police is not prepared for that. That's one like the more operative way of understanding this. But beyond, you also have that: do politicians need those votes to win? So Madre de Dios is a big place with few people because it's in the middle of the Amazon, right? So, and it's very far from Lima. So Do we need that? And I want to let's let's see a different place. Let's see Mexico.
Hmm.
Just finished an election. Have you heard from the candidates, like as part of the broad discussion, what are they going to do with these 10 cities that are in the first place of the most dangerous places in the world in terms of homicides, that are only Mexicans? Colima in the first place. Have you heard these cities as part of the conversation? Or sometimes, actually, you can say that now the new president of Mexico, without any bias against her, comes from being mayor of Mexico City, of Distrito Federal. So a second layer is that these places are usually far from the center of political and economic power, right?
Hmm.
A third layer is political linkages. So as you can, as I explained a moment ago, you have representatives, so Madre de Dios, like actually are trying to enact ways to extend the possibility of these illegal miners to become this euphemism that I don't understand, that it's informal, not illegal, which
Hmm.
means that they are trying to be legal, but with the extension to this time as an informal becoming a legal, actually what you are doing is extending illegal practices on time. So
Yeah.
that's part of the answer. I think that there might be others, but that's what came to my mind.
And you said something else that I want to dwell on before we start thinking about impacts and how people are responding, which is you compared a previous area of Pablo Escobar and his hippos and El Chapo and things like that versus post pandemic. So what has changed? I mean, you sort of alluded to it in terms of the outsourcing of certain things, and I've heard this before too, where before Mexican cartels were vertically integrated. Now, no, like they'll outsource to local Ecuadorian gangs to do the dirty work, and they sit in Mexico in their 10 cities or whatever, and they're fine. Which seems like more of a change in tactics than anything else. But what has changed? What makes this a new era and the challenges more serious?
So I think that you can see this from an in the same way you can analyze other economies. So illegal economies at the end are economies that move up beyond law. So maybe you can take apart the regulation constraints, but eventually the incentives and the way market works like in other markets. Okay. With this premise, what you have as trends all across the globe are also working here. So you have changes in globalization, you have new sources and other sources, you have changes in value chain, particularly you have changes in logistics. So Pablo Escobar, for example, he was a genius in particular in logistics, as well as Chapo, because you have here this phenomenon that Colombia actually does not have a big port city. The big cities in Colombia are actually Mediterranean in terms not that they are in the Mediterranean. It means that they are in the center of the country.
Hmm.
So this guy was able, just to illustrate this, to to bring animals from Africa to his ranch in the middle of the country because he was a master of logistics. Similar with Chapo, submarines coming to the U.S. Chapo. So all these innovations. So, but now you have that value chain has expanded, you have new actors, you have technology. So that is why you can have, and again, technology, one important issue in this. So criminal organizations are using technology. So you have an expansion of opportunities for other organizations local, nationally to work national. So you have a largest market. That is what you have now. You don't have these, and literally listen to the world. You don't have these cartels that are like use it for the other world, the legal world. You don't
Mm,
have anymore these cartels that are absorbing the whole chain because they are working on that with different strategies. But now you have an expansion on more open market. So
mhm.
you have to see it in an economic way. And what you have now with criminal organizations, one more idea, they have diversified. Before, it was, I'm saying Pablo Escobar, but you can use other names. Pablo Escobar is the most known here, right? But you can like Pablo Escobar and drugs. So maybe he had other business, but it was Pablo Escobar and drugs. Then you have the drugs is one of the business. You have
Yeah.
at the same time illegal mining. You are taxing for every what we say pagar cupos. We have every single thing that migrants are doing, they're paying to someone, and that money goes to the cartel. We have an explosion of these delivery apps in Latin America. If you see it here in the US, you can't imagine because of migration. Now you have that all these people who came to this new country are getting a bike, and with this bike, they are starting to do delivery, so they have a job.
Mhm.
All these people are taxed by criminal organizations. All these people have to pay a tax from the earnings. So what you have is like one organization has many, 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 sometimes more than three ways of income. So that also changed. So it works
Yeah.
like a market.
I hadn't thought to ask you this, but as you were talking, does the rise of cryptocurrency change this in any meaningful way, or is that another one of these things that people talk about from a fear mongering perspective, but it doesn't actually change things that much? I'm asking because it seems to give you an anonymous, more secure way, a way to avoid governments in terms of moving capital and moving money. But I don't know if you sense that that's what's happening, or if that's just sort of something that people worry about on the side.
There is not that much evidence, and it doesn't mean that it is not happening. So I would argue that sometimes criminal organizations are moving faster than governments in terms of technology. If so, I would not have any doubt that crypto is already part of their operations.
Mhm.
Now, that being said, you have two problems. So we have two problems there. Why, on the one side, it is the nature of crypto. You cannot find out what's happening there. It's very obscure. On the other hand, you have that the church of crypto will never allow this conversation to be really on the table, right? So because of that, I would say that they should be, because of their nature, the criminal organizations, already on the trend, on the wave, but there is little evidence about it.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a broader conversation there to be had about technology too, because you talked about, a lot of these groups are able to use technology to expand their markets or expand their capabilities. Well, maybe let's move the conversation now to sort of what the right response is, because the depressing part of this is that it seems like the most effective response to crime has been from characters like Nayib Bukele, who gets most of the headlines these days, and he's a very good PR man. You probably we can put on your communications hat there too. I was reading this article from John Lee Anderson in the New Yorker about Mr. Daniel Noboa, who's also sort of an interesting one in and of his own right. Um, and also, I mean, just the rapid deterioration of Ecuador too. How you can go from you're one of the safe spots to suddenly you're the worst spot to maybe you're going back to one of the safe spots because you're taking Bukele's plan off the shelf. But all of which is to say, I mean, I think they're calling these policies mano dura, so iron fist, and it's nothing special. It's basically mass incarceration and militarized policing. And in the case of Bukele, and maybe in Ecuador and some of these other places, uh, state capture. So like the line between, well, who's the criminal and who's not the criminal, and who's corrupt and who's not corrupt, like it starts to go very very fast. But I mean, is there an alternative to the strongman approach, or are some of these places just so far gone that it takes, you know, a meaner version who's willing to get their hands dirty in politics to go in and clean it up before you can even think about reform?
So you have one important question to start with is crime was there in the last 20 years. I'm talking about this century, okay? And I'm part of that, we, those who were not aligned with the iron fist solution, were saying, okay, we need another kind of solutions. We need prevention, and we need at the same time a strong, efficient uh, police bodies. But it didn't work. It didn't work because of the nature of our countries, because of the culture of our countries, because of the nature of our states, because of the nature of our politicians. Look for an answer. But the fact is that it didn't work. And people at the end were suffering crime from crime. Okay. That being said, you have that in Central America, you had a particular and specific kind of crime, which is gangs. You have uh, all these Mara Salvatrucha, and so on. So based on that, and I have this feeling that the community of policymakers and researchers were saying this in a very, very low voice, which is, how the fuck are we going to solve this problem with these gangs? I asked myself many times after a conference that question. What the fuck? Are we really selling this idea, marketing this idea of crime prevention with these gangs? So maybe we can solve a few lives, which is valuable, but not the whole problem. So then you have Bukele in a very specific conditions, in a very small country, which is almost a city. So in addition to that, you have that he tried to negotiate, it didn't work, and he had this, as you said, massive incarceration with one particular and very specific characteristic that you can clearly identify because of the tattoos who are the people that you are going to incarcerate. So if you see the pictures, all of them, if not 98% of them, have tattoos. So now let's talk about the massive incarcerations. You have the calculations that you have 70,000 people right now there without any kind of or guarantee. So actually, he enacted a new law that allow police to incarcerate them without any lawyer or previous process. And now they are there waiting for a process. So technically, what you have there is concentration camps. Technically, they are there, and you don't know when it's gonna end. Okay, but he solved the fucking problem. He solved it. And I was listening to his interview with Carson Tucker. That's his name, right?
Tucker Carlson, yep.
Tucker Carlson, yes. This representative of the U.S. in the world. And
God help us.
and Bukele said something that is actually is common sense. You don't need academia to. He said, you want development, you need peace. and I gave them peace. Now you can walk around, go to the grocery store, and you are not afraid that someone will kill you. And it's fucking true. So, and I'm using these words because it is really there are the two questions here that comes back to rule of law. How can you solve this kind of problems with peaceful and soft measures? Nobody could do it out of very local, specific cities in Latin American history, in recent history, I mean, but not nationwide and not with criminal organizations. And if you can't, how do you deploy law enforcement in a way that does not empower the new leader, caudillo, in a way that he will become an authoritarian? And that question has not been solved in Latin America historically.
Yeah, I mean, you even brought up the example of Mexico. I mean, I remember very well AMLO when he was running the last time when he was elected. I mean, he was talking about pacification and he was talking about amnesties and about even maybe legalization of drugs. I think what was it, hugs not bullets? He wanted to give like the cartels hugs not bullets. And as soon as he gets in, what is he doing? He's militarizing the police. He's forming a new national guard to go after crime, and crime has plateaued in Mexico. It's not going down since he took over. Because he did that. And you asked me if Shanebaum has been talking about those 10 Mexican cities. I haven't followed close enough to know if she's talked about those cities, but I know she's not talking about hugs over bullets. I know she's talking about completing the militarization of Mexican police forces so that there is a non-corrupt force that the state can rely on to do battle against some of these things, and maybe that'll be something that Mexico can do. But this is another thing, like. I've cited this a couple different times over the podcast over the last couple of months. But if you survey just Mexicans themselves, if democracy has been good to you, you're not going to get a majority that says democracy has been good. And so, exactly to your point, like if a caudillo or if a potential authoritarian is promising peace, you probably say yes to that because the alternative is not particularly good. Can you think of any country that I mean, like, I can think of countries where the problem didn't take off. Like Costa Rica has always been a really interesting example of something about how Costa Rica functions wards it off. And maybe Costa Rica will be the next Ecuador. I don't
They do
know.
not have military bodies like this.
Right, but they also don't have the same levels of violence. So are they
So far, I
are
think that migration maybe will change this in the
they
near
will.
future.
Well, so I guess we don't have examples of to your point of anyone that has done it in a way that is not the iron fist.
You have small cities with examples, but not with this kind of crime. You have Cali, you have Bogota, some points during the 90s. So you have examples in small cities. We have also examples in Brazil of small cities or cities, but you don't have a nationwide example of this kind of change. And another paradox, and I think I'm going to connect this with Ecuador, is that criminal organizations now are starting to confront nation governments more directly in some countries. And at that point, you are, they are, they are crossing the line of being criminal and be also a political organization. And at that point, legally, I'm not going to talk about the sociology of this, but legally, you can be also a terrorist rebel group. And that is based on that, is that Novoa in Ecuador says that they are in an armed conflict, right? And I think that will be a trend as long as you see criminal organizations trying to get control of some territories. And when those territories are affecting the other side of the country, the other dimension of the country, the legal dimension of the country, the economy of the country, the powerful people of the country, like in Guayaquil in Ecuador, or in the port in Ecuador, you will see these kind of situations raising. I think that Mexico is one example of how this future could be seen in some states, in some cities. The relationship between crime and government bodies are completely diffused,
Mhm.
right? And that is why people like Bukele, because they brought a solution that worked in this specific context, is becoming trendy.
I think it's fair to say, and tell me if you disagree with this. This question is going to be a little more philosophical, but we know what governments want. Governments want rule of law. They want peace. They want control. Um, what do criminal or
Who is the government? Elaborate on that.
any government, whether it's democratic or authoritarian, the end goals are ultimately the same: that the government should have a monopoly on violence within a certain territorial boundary, where there are certain rules that the government enforces, and that people bend the knee to the government in general. Like, that's sort of the end goal of government. And the question I wanted to throw at you was, because you sort of talked about how these criminal groups are taking on governments head on to the point where they're even embedding within them. This is sort of like what Hezbollah has done in Lebanon. Starts as a splinter group, it's a gang, it's a terrorist group, and then suddenly it has a political party, and it does services in parts of southern Lebanon, and then it also has the military wing. It's sort of all these things at the same time. What do these criminal groups want? Do they want to be do they want control over their own territories and to be left alone? Do they want to capture the state? Do they want to be the ones who control everything? Would they look favorably on something that said, okay, fine, like we'll recognize all of your money and your things like that, just come in from the cold and help us get stability, and you'll get more money anyway? Like, what do you think they're pushing for? If the state is pushing for, as you said, if Bukele is pushing for peace, are the gangs pushing for chaos, or are they pushing for control of the system? Does that question
They
make
are
sense?
pushing for money, and to have money, they need control. And this control could come in different ways. Sometimes local, very local control, localized control. In some places in Mexico, they are they have people with IDs. We call it carnetización. So they already have IDs that allow them to move out or in the territory. Okay. So this control, sometimes you need control of the regulations. In Peru, for example, what you have is a Congress that is very linked to organized crime in different ways. So you have that they are enacting laws that allow them to work more freely. But I want to discuss this idea that governments, all of them want peace. I would say that they also want control. And what is happening gradually is that you are moving from this ideal of rule of law to an idea of rule of crime. And if you, as a government, need the rule of crime to have control with them, this is different with Bukele, and that is why people love them. Because usually, when you have this kind of iron fist and you have some kind of success, what you eventually realize is that people who took control of the government were another kind of mafia.
Mm-hmm.
And in El Salvador, I have to say that is not clear. That actually Bukele is a new kind of mafia. You have you can be very suspicious, but it is not like a state, right? Maybe he's letting some people to do their things as strategically, but not like you have the new criminal organization is in control of the government. What usually happens in Latin America historically. So the rule of law is the rule of crime again. So the and that is, I think, one of the factors of the success of Bukele, which is it is not a new criminal organization taking control of the government, a mafia. Uh, as it happened, for example, in a different context, in a different situation, when Alberto Fujimori in Peru dismantled, with the very good help of the police, the Sendero Luminoso, the guerrilla, suddenly he was so popular as president and his government was so well accepted that immediately it became one of the most corrupt
Mm.
governments in history in our country, right? It seems that it is not happening in El Salvador yet, with a bold yet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. To me, it's already happening. So, like, the Constitution doesn't matter anymore. He's got loyal. He's basically controls the Supreme Court. He controls Congress. The thing about making Bitcoin legal tender, he also the El Salvadoran government created a wallet, a digital wallet that everybody had to use to get their Bitcoin. There was a fee attached to it that the government was trying to get. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. The Bukele has been buying Bitcoin and very famously buying Bitcoin for El Salvador. Somebody asked me, is that actually being controlled by the state, or is that just in his own digital wallet? And he's saying that he's buying it for El Salvador. And I don't know. Do you know the answer to the question? So, like, he might not be a mafia in the sense that I don't think that he's like trading, children to be sex workers in Mexico or something like that. But certainly he's trying to ensconce himself as the philosopher king, the philosopher Bitcoin king of El Salvador. So he will give you your peace and your stability, but he will be the mafia that nobody else messes
Yes,
with.
and people are like ready to accept those kind of crimes, right?
Yeah.
Uh, if you ask me what I see where Salvador is going is a kind of Singapore, right? There is no democracy. You cannot say whatever you want. Obviously, absolute power comes with absolute corruption in many ways, but you have control of this uh, city government that it's called a country.
Hmm. I mean, that would be a best case scenario for El Salvador.
Yes, yes, yes. And it's wishful thinking at the end. I think that we cannot forget that El Salvador is not an island. El Salvador has borders, that many of the gangs that were not incarcerated, they went to, that's part of the migration, they went to other countries. Actually, some of them have been enrolled by Mexican criminal organizations, or some others have located in the points of the border where they can tax migration.
Hmm.
So, and that is a reason to think that at any point you can have uh, criminal organizations trying to come back. So, at the same time, you will have in the near future international pressure to to do something with these concentration camps that you have actually there. I think that now international community somehow, not all of them, are there human rights organizations that they're doing a great job right now, and journalists and media doing great job like El Foco in El Salvador. But at the end you have like some kind of acceptance of that, because when you see the pictures, you see all these people with tattoos that you identify with guns, and somehow you rationalize as they should be there, but they shouldn't be there under these conditions and with these kind of processes. And now I think it's reported 300 people who passed away in these prisons. So when this number starts to increase, international pressure would be larger. What do you do with them? Are you gonna have fast track trials for 70,000 people? You have to maybe leave some of them to go. Are you gonna export them to other country? What are you gonna do to them? So I think that those are questions that nobody has answered, and maybe nobody has asked yet.
Well, we know they're asking those questions in Ecuador because I'll put a link to this article. So John Lee Anderson basically palled around with Noboa for a couple of months, and his government is unironically talking about building concentration camps in Antarctica and just sending all of the criminals to Antarctica. And they got so far down the road that they basically said you can only build research facilities in Antarctica. So they had to figure out, well, how could they massage the definitions enough that a jail qualified as a research facility? So is it the military's in control of it and they're taking some scientific data, and at the same time, like maybe it's the criminals that are taking the scientific data? It's sort of a really interesting aside. But you're absolutely right. Like they're looking for a place to push them all.
So, and you can think of, so again, this transnational problem with the local specific manifestations, and you can think of it as there are already places that are Mad Max look like. So maybe not in the middle of the desert, but this idea of guns with the resources that they have, killing each other for the territory and the resources and the natural resources, it's there very locally, very locally. So, and this is the paradox, right? So I was thinking today, I was listening. This will be maybe completely out of topic, but I was listening today a podcast with the CEO of Grammarly,
Mm-hmm.
and there was an interesting discussion about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence, from his viewpoint, will not uh, burn jobs all across the world, but it will be a new opportunity, as it happened with Microsoft Office and Internet and so on in these in each of these apocalyptic eras of technology. But I was thinking at the same time, hey, come on, you are really talking about your bubble. Let's talk about these specific places where crime is controlling everything. Are you really saying that AI is going to solve the problem of jobs in these places? So I was listening to this before your podcast, and it's two completely different worlds that we're discussing about, right? And that is why I feel that this idea of inequalities is becoming even more territorial and far from one side to another. So you can have at the same time in my country, Lima, in the center of Lima, Miraflores, Miami look alike, some places, the best restaurant in the world within this district, and a few miles from there, you have places that are absolutely controlled by crime in this Mad Max approach. At the same time, in the same country.
Where do we go from here, Elo? Like, do you like it? This does not feel like an optimistic trajectory. So, I mean, do you have any hope? When you were last on the podcast with Ignacio, the part of that podcast that made me stop in my tracks was when he talked about narco violence hasn't really been that big of a deal in Argentina, but it's coming. And so Milei is going to have to think about how to deal with that. And I was like, well, okay. So, like, I almost like, I like what Milei is doing with the economy. The reforms all make sense to me. But if we're going to get narco violence as far down as into the Southern Cone, like we're talking about a really, really different phenomenon. And we haven't even touched on, we're talking about specifically Latin America and the Caribbean. It's not like there is an organized crime in Europe or, Balkan gangs or Italian mafias and, all sorts of criminal
Armenian
enterprises.
mafias in Ecuador. Take
Yeah.
that. So, ceteris paribus, everything goes badly. Ceteris
Mhm.
paribus. Okay, that is why when you see solutions like Bukele's, you see a reaction from other governments and from the people, because everything else is ceteris paribus. Is promises, is operations, maybe show no pers. In Peru, for example, which is a case I really know, uh, you had in the last, I think, 6 or 7 years, you had like 11 or 12 ministers of interior, which is like the homeland security here in the US. So, but then you go to Chile and you have like they had 2 or 3 in the last years, and the problem is still there. So I think that there is a lack of new approaches and new solutions first, and we have to recognize that it implies some level of enforcement, and some governments and leaders should recognize that that level of enforcement could drive to human rights issues. I think that, and if you're a leader, you have to embrace it. You don't have to promote, but you can have those kinds of attacks at some point if you're going to face that at the same time that you do your prevention that has to do in the long run. So, secondly, I think that to transnational problems, you need transnational solutions. But while Lula is saying, "Hey, Milei, please say I'm sorry before we talk," or at the same time, when you have like uh, Ecuador, uh, Novoa fighting with AMLO, with the embassy, like
Yeah.
never done before. So you have, come on, you have to be a partner with Mexico because Sinaloa cartel is in your ground. So he is your partner. Whether you like him or not, he is your partner. So we need transnational solutions to transnational problems. And you have global solutions. You just talk. So drugs is an issue. Illegal mining is an issue. And this all problem is also about supply chains. So if you think that they are traveling in balloons, they're traveling in legal ships, in legal planes, uh, submarines apart. So I think that nobody is really trying to solve this in a serious way because they are very uh, concerned about domestics. Maybe Novoa, so with all his issues, he's trying.
He is
So
trying.
he's trying. And that's the paradox with the left versus right. It
Mm.
is, and I feel that I am a center left person, that I come from a center left tradition of solutions. But come on, we are not providing new solutions. So if we're not providing new solutions, the right wing will provide new solutions. And eventually, the ideal would be to have a common solution. But that is not happening in this new world of polarization.
Yeah, and I hate to keep referencing this article, but I mean, it was eye opening because one of the things that Naboa is complaining about to his interviewer is, the United States just had this big argument and approved all these billions of dollars of aid for Israel and billions of dollars of aid for Ukraine and things like that. I got 10 million. I'm at war with these cartels and these drug overlords in my country, and I got $10 million. I can't do anything with $10 million to go after these people.
And let me
Um,
tell you something that will connect with your initial figures.
mhm.
So all these armed conflicts and wars in the Middle East and other places are horrible, are bloody, they're killing children, and I hate them. But at the same time, that I'm concerned not only about Gaza, but also about Sudan, about Yemen, all those places that nobody talked about in the US, but it's there killing people forever in this era.
Yeah.
Taking that, more people are dying in Latin America. Far more people are dying in Latin America in the cruelest ways sometimes because of organized crime. So I hate to use this kind of graphic ideas, okay? But you remember the time when ISIS was very trendy because of they were beheading people. That's the way it worked. The
Yes.
wording,
Hmm.
beheading people.
Hmm.
I, at the same time, did a very fast, quick look at beheading people in Mexico from cartels. So ISIS were amateurs in comparison to what was happening next to the US with beheading. So I will stop with these graphic examples, but I just wanted to show that this is happening everywhere in Latin America. It's very cruel. Lo- Me, really, thousands of people are dying, mostly innocent people in some countries, if not are victims in other ways as migrants. And I agree with Novoa. So come on, US, what's happening here? Latin America, wasn't it your backyard, you told us? Okay, if you want to be if you want us to be your backyard, okay, but take care of your backyard.
Yeah. It goes back to that question though that I asked about what is the end goal for criminal organizations, because ISIS, the reason that ISIS was itself decapitated in the end was because they wanted a political organization. They wanted a caliphate in the heart of the Middle East, and they were going to exert political control and have armies and take over cities and take over oil infrastructure and all these other things. They were very loud because they had a religious ideology that they wanted more of the conflict, because it's sort of that Al Qaeda ideology. The more external actors we bring in, the more the Muslims will rise up, the more we get holy war and jihad and, off to the races. Whereas, to your point, these criminal organizations, in some sense, they want quiet on some level, right? Like they want you to not know that they're stitching people's faces on soccer balls when they're doing the wrong thing. They don't want you to know all the things that are happening in the background in their small towns and things like that, which is why it's why that thing that you mentioned about, but they're becoming more ambitious. They are confronting the state more directly. It seems to me it's not in their interest to confront the state directly, and yet they're doing so. I don't know. Do they just see that the state is weak? Maybe the state is so bad that it's not like enforcing enough rule of law for the criminal organizations to work. They have to go in and say like, "Hey, we need a couple basic things if we're going to still make money." I don't know. It seems like a.
At the end, it's about power. Come on. So Pablo Escobar was elected senator in Colombia before he was underground. So sometimes it's not like I don't want to be in the shadows. It's like this is not the moment to be in the shadows. I want power. And if I can be the ruler of this place, maybe some of them will think I will be the ruler of this place, right?
Mhm.
So, first, I would not say that I would not try to generalize the rationale of these leaders and these criminal organizations. I would say that it's about power, and what you have is incentives to be in one side or another of legality, of the shadows, we can say, or how you connect with legality and the legal power. So, and it's about country specific conditions, policies, and social conditions. Pandemic, we can talk about it, just to say a
Yeah.
couple of things about it. For me, there's a before and after of the pandemic with crime. Because while most of our countries in Latin America suffered of confinement, criminal organizations started to work
Mm.
actually harder at the same time to take advantage of this absence of policing, of rule of law. Secondly, in, actually in some places, they provided services, they provided food when you had people who could not work. So they were empowered. Their criminal networks increased during the pandemic. So, and this is very important, because of the economic crisis that was a consequence in many ways of the pandemic and the lack of government solutions in many places. What you have is a lot of young people without opportunities. Many of them dropped schools during the pandemic with 15, 16 years old. What are their options? At the
Yeah.
same time, you have a criminalization of Netflix in Latin America. So you have, like, if you see the soap operas, if you see who is the hero, the anti-hero, okay, but who is the hero? Who is the one who eventually gets the benefits? El Chapo, and all these narcos myth, right? Myth, not so myth. So I see that everything drives to this kind of economy. I don't know why I'm saying this, but I think it was important to mention.
Yeah. Look, we're only scratching the surface, and so we're going to have to come back and talk about these things more. And the point you made about the pandemic is really powerful and really well taken. But I thought I would just end where we started and say, we've talked about Ecuador, we've talked about Argentina, we've talked about all these different places. The place we haven't talked about is Venezuela, which is the biggest source of migrants in Latin America and the Caribbean right now. Like that is, if you're looking for the epicenter of instability on the South American continent, it's arguably Venezuela, where arguably a criminal organization is now running that country. And you're also creating millions of migrants who, to your point, haven't been going to school, have been living in a lawless place for a long time, are probably easy targets for criminal organizations as they try to make their way north. Um, do you think it's fair to put that much emphasis on Venezuela? Do you think that, obviously nothing's going to happen because, as you said, Ecuador is fighting with Mexico over, arresting people in embassies, and Lula and Milei are fighting over literally nothing. But it seems to me like Venezuela, if you could get some kind of regional solution to Venezuela and stabilize that wound, could you at least now you're sort of dealing with countries and governments in every one of these countries, and maybe you can start some transnational solution? I don't know, but Venezuela is, it seems to me, the center of all this right now. I wonder how you think about that.
I endorse that 100%. So, and again, let's be careful. Migration is a problem because you are having a lot of vulnerable people moving from one place to another, and you have that the new places do not have resources, and these vulnerable people are also victims of organized crimes in many ways. And one of those ways is that young people could be captured by organized crime. So it migration is not a problem because it's moving criminals from one place to another as a generalization. It was because of what I explained. That being said, so yes, and there are waves of migration also. So actually,
Mhm.
the first wave of migration from Venezuela was professionals and very well-educated people. Then you have new waves when you have that the more vulnerable people are trying to leave the country. So based on that, I do think that there are there should be incentives for countries to have an agreement, at least that stability in Venezuela would stop that migration that keeps coming. But as you said, and I'm going to repeat what you said. So while these leaders are fighting each other instead of looking for a solution uh, of their issues and migration as a global problem in general, transnational problem, a regional problem for Latin America. So maybe the US, if they were concerned about Latin America, could lead this kind of agreement about this. I don't know. So I really feel that somehow they don't care, or they are surpassed by the problem.
Hmm. Well, on that rousing and optimistic note, Elo, thank you for opening our eyes about this. And I mean, we're gonna have to come back and do another hour and a half on this because like I said, I feel like we only scratched the surface. Is there anything else you want to say to the listeners before we say goodbye for now?
I'm doing of pessimism a personal philosophy, so we can have a conversation about pessimism, how pessimism maybe is a political way to approach problems instead of this kind of. So I will explain to you in this way. We who were trained as policymakers, we were trained to be optimistic. And we
Mm.
are marketing optimism with politicians as partners to all these people who are living pessimism in their everyday lives because they don't have another option, because you don't have this time frame to see the future in other way that And otherwise, what you are doing is just living every day as you can. So there is a gap between the political slash technocratic supply and this everyday life of the people. And those who are migrating too, but also this 20% of poverty in Peru and this 40% of poverty, 30% now in Peru after the pandemic, and 40% or 45% in Argentina, and so on, and keep going. So they are pessimistic by nature. It doesn't mean that they don't think that tomorrow could be better. It is not that way. It is that you don't have time to really project your future in the way that we middle class educated people do. So optimism is a privilege. That is, and I wanted to do this footnote because in the previous conversation, I also sounded very pessimistic. I think that pessimism is a kind of realism that we can leverage to understand that the discussion is not about if we have full glass or empty glass. We have a few amount of water. We have to work with it. It is not about how do you say it.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that was so striking about Milei's campaign. He did not campaign on things are going to get better. He campaigned on it's going to suck for the first couple of years because we haven't taken the medicine, and you think it's bad now. It's going to get worse, way worse before it gets better. And people,
amazing example.
yeah, but you're still trying to use pessimism in an optimistic way. It's fine. I've been doing my own research, and it turns out that at least most psychologists think that we evolved to be more pessimistic because if you were too optimistic, you got eaten by a lion on the Sahara or you got killed by the rival tribe. So in some sense, there was a self-selection for folks that were cynical or that were pessimistic. And to your point, when things have degraded to the point that they have in Latin America and the Caribbean, the optimists aren't going to win. You sort of need, this is why Bukele is so interesting to me. You need the figure that is going to take on some of these figures sort of head on. It's like I love William Manchester and his biographies of Winston Churchill. And the very first chapter of that biography, he basically, and I think accurately, talks about Churchill as the West's Hitler. That he had all the same characteristics. He just bent those characteristics in service of some larger ideal. And I think the point that you're making here is if you want to do battle with sort of crime organizations that have achieved the level of power that they have right now, hugs is not going to do it for you. You're going to have to be tougher than they are. And that is not the class of politician that exists. And the type of politician that is willing to do that and not do what Bukele is doing is also fairly rare. So it doesn't end us in a very good place.
Yes, pragmatism is a value in these times, especially because you are more aware of what is happening out there. And
well, pragmatism and also like a willingness to get one's hands dirty, which in our current media environment, like, no one is allowed to do, like, you want all the things that the pragmatist has to do, but you look down on the pragmatist for doing those things. And we have more, there's a whole tension there as well.
we can have a whole conversation about this, and we can go back to Weber and his idea of responsibility and courage, right? And this idea of responsibility is that you have to do things and take responsibility after doing things. Now you are avoiding things in order to avoid responsibility.
Right. Which again, I mean, you made this point already very eloquently, but it's why, as much as somebody like Bukele scares you and me for different reasons, but scares us both, I think, in similar ways. At least he's doing something. At least Noboa is doing something. At least Milei is doing something. Like, a lot of people haven't been doing things for a long time, and maybe that's why we are where we are. Okay. That was great. Thanks.
Yes, we had a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.